Thank you so much for joining us on this lovely Friday afternoon. I'm sure that you'd all prefer to be doing other great things, especially in the beautiful outdoors, but we really appreciate you being here with us today to learn more about the Fulbright program and specifically to talk about the study research program, where we will walk through various elements of the program and help you get started conceiving a project. So this is a webinar that's being offered by the Office of National Scholarship Advisement. I am Dr. Laurie Staff. I am the Assistant Director and Faculty Mentor for the office. And with me today are my colleagues, Dr. Mitch Habza, who is the Senior Program Manager for Graduate Programs, and my fellow faculty mentor, Dr. Nilanjana Bhattacharya, who is also a Barrett faculty member as well as myself here at ASU. And so we're just going to walk you through the various components. We do want to give you this information. It's probably going to be a lot, so you might want to think about taking notes, but we will have this recording posted on our YouTube video so that you can go back in references. And for those people who obviously weren't able to join us today, they'll be able to watch it. So we are going to be recording that, so that just to give you a heads up for that. Welcome again, and let's get started. So, that was not what I wanted to do. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so you might be wondering what exactly the Fulbright U.S. Student Program is. It is a program that was created in 1946 by the U.S. Congress and is sponsored by the U.S. Department of State. The mission of the Fulbright program is to foster mutual cultural understanding between Americans and people in other countries. The idea is that if we get to know each other better, we understand each other better, the world will be a more peaceful and productive place. And hopefully maybe we'll stop killing each other. It hasn't worked yet, but we're keeping our fingers crossed. So that's really important actually for you all to keep in the back of your minds, is that there is this very clear mission that the Fulbright program has, and that has to do with this mutual cultural understanding. As far as the U.S. student program is concerned, these are programs that are open to individuals who graduate from U.S. institutions who are U.S. Citizens. The grants last between 9 and 12 months, so it depends on the country and depends on the program. There are over 2,000 grants that are awarded each year, so there's lots of opportunities out there. And there are 4 main types of awards that exist. We're going to focus on one of those types of awards today. The awards are very generous usually. They cover most of the costs that are associated with traveling to the other countries, living expenses. A lot of times we'll cover aspects of the research costs you may have. Sometimes they will cover things like tuition if you're enrolling in a graduate program or some kind of institution. Sometimes they don't. It all depends. So those are things you really need to look very carefully when you're evaluating the program specifically that you want to apply for. And there are about 140 different countries that you can propose a project in. So that's really exciting and gives you lots of opportunities. So why are we here today in mid-April, when the deadline for the Fulbrights are not until usually early October? In this case, I think their deadline is going to be October 8th. The reason is that these are very involved applications that take a lot of time and a lot of energy to complete successfully. And so we really want you to get started as early as possible. And especially, we do not want you to lose time over the summer. What tends to happen is students, break for summer and then they're like, I'm free, I have nothing to do. But that is not going to be the best use of your time, because once we return in the fall, as you can see from this timeline, our internal deadline is very early, September 10th. That does not give you a lot of time. If classes begin next fall semester, I believe it's August 22nd, that's not enough time for you to develop a very convincing proposal that's going to get you a Fulbright. And so what we want you to do is start now. And we're, of course, here to help you with that process. But then we want you to be working through the summer, drafting your proposals, working with us in the office. And then when you come back, what we are hoping is that you'll just be revising, right? You'll just be putting those finishing touches on the proposal. We do have that internal deadline of September 10th for a very important reason. And that is because we have a process by which you will undergo an interview made up of faculty and others who are experts either in your region or former Fulbrighters or others who have expertise perhaps in your field, who will give you valuable feedback on your application. And then if all goes well, we will then endorse you and add a sheet to the top of your application that says, basically, we vetted this applicant. We think they're a very strong candidate for a Fulbright. And that, of course, is going to help you tremendously in the application process. So this is why it's really important for you to work with us, but also for you to meet all those deadlines. So, and we'll have lots of ways for you to engage with us and make sure that you're getting the assistance you need throughout the process. Okay, so as I said, we are going to focus on one of the types of the Fulbright Awards today, but there are several different types, so you might want to be thinking about which one is the best award for you. So there are the English Teaching Assistant Awards, and so those are awards that give applicants the opportunity to go to other countries and be an English teaching assistant, not an English teacher, so don't start panicking if you're thinking you might want to do this and you don't have expertise in English language pedagogy or second language acquisition. That's not really the focus. The focus is to give native speakers of English an opportunity to go and help with teaching English and making sure that people are, getting the speaking the way that we actually speak, right? The other types of award are Open Study Research Awards. And actually within that, there are 3 categories of those subcategories, I should say. There's the Graduate Degree Award, which will fund your graduate degree program in another country. Usually they only cover 1 year, although there are, again, some exceptions. It really depends on the program. So you should read very carefully through the country description to see what they cover. So this means you apply to a graduate program in another country, and then you simultaneously apply for a Fulbright, and then Fulbright covers the costs of that program for at least 1 year. So that's a really great opportunity. There are also creative and performing arts grants. So this is if you're somebody who is a creative type in music or art or other forms of creative work, you can apply for an award based on something that a project you're developing that you would like to carry out in another country, perhaps work with experts or work with master teachers in those areas that you're working on to give you the best access to the tools you need to forward your own projects. And then there are country-specific awards and these range from an award. You can go to Italy to learn about the slow food movement in Italian cuisine, which sounds amazing. I think I want to do that program. Or the National Geographic Awards, which allows you to go and do like storytelling and work with people in different countries on those things. So again, the key is really to read very carefully through the website for the U.S. Fulbright student program that describes each country and each program, because they will vary greatly. So a lot of times you may ask us questions about general things that have to do with these programs, and our answer is going to be, it depends. And that is because these programs really do vary greatly and have unique characteristics to them. What's really important also to note is that the Open Study Research projects, which we're going to talk about today, all require a 2-page statement of grant purpose. And that's sounds like not such a big deal, but the thing is to get everything in there that needs to be in there, that to describe the project that you want to do, make sure that it's convincing, as well as address the Fulbright mission, is not necessarily so easy to do. And so that's what we're here to help you with. So you may be at the stage right now where you're still trying to choose which award is best for you, and that's okay. That's obviously something that you want to take some time and really think about. So we have this little flow chart that indicates ways in which that you can think about the Fulbright Awards and how they align with your particular experiences and your particular goals, right? So for example, if you're looking for funding to do a graduate program in another country, then obviously the Graduate Degree Award is the one for you to choose. If you're looking to do an independent self-designed project, then the Study Research Award is best for you probably. If you're looking to grow as a creative or performing artist, then you would apply for the Creative and Performing Arts Award. And of course, if you want to just engage with a foreign culture through teaching, again, assisting with the teaching of English, then the ETA award is probably best for you. So take some time to look through these things and think about what it is that best suits, again, your particular interests and your particular experiences. So we're going to focus today on the Open Study Research Awards. So these are programs in which applicants design their own projects and typically work with advisors at foreign universities or other institutions of higher education, or even perhaps with nonprofit organizations or other types of institutions where you're going to have interactions with folks in another country who are going to help you with completing your project. So when we're talking about the Study Research Awards, we want to think about several things when we're conceiving a project. Obviously, this is going to be the most important component of your application, and it's going to be the thing that's going to convince the Fulbright Commission that your project is worthy of funding. So you want to think about whether or not this is feasible. Can you do it in the time frame proposed? Do you have the requisite education, background, experience in order for you to carry out the project? Do you have contacts in the place where you're going that's going to assist you? Do you have all of the things that you need in order to be able to carry out this project? Also, really important is that you must demonstrate that you have a compelling reason to go to the place where you want to carry out the project, right? That you can't just say, well, this would be nice because I love croissants. So France, it sounds like a great place for me to be. I can do my research and eat all the croissants I want. That's not a compelling reason, right? So what you need to demonstrate is that you absolutely need to be in the place that you're applying to in order to complete the project successfully. You, again, need to make sure that you're demonstrating that you have the requisite knowledge, understanding, background in education and coursework or field work or anything else that's necessary for you to be able to carry out the project. You need to think about language. Is the place somewhere where you're going to have to be fairly proficient in a language, or will you have the ability to engage in English? That's going to be really important. Another really, really super important thing, and things that a lot of times Fulbright applicants kind of forget and put on the back burner, but I would really recommend that you do not do this. And that is thinking about how you're going to engage with the community once you're there, right? So Fulbright is not just going to pay for you to go do research for the sake of your own research. Again, thinking about that mission of mutual cultural understanding, you need to demonstrate that whatever it is that you're going to do is going to have that effect. You are not going to just do what we call parachute research, where you drop in, do whatever work you want to do for your own sake, and then leave and never really engage with your community, never really demonstrate any benefit to the community that you're working in. Ultimately, that means that you need to have something in addition to your research project that demonstrates a way you're engaging with the community. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit more as we go along, but don't forget about that. You should also be able to demonstrate that this project is something that you really need to do in order for you to advance your academic or professional goals, right? It's not just a side project that you think would be interesting. So again, Fulbright wants to see that this is something that you really need to do, that this is the logical next step in your academic or professional life goals, and that this is going to get you to where you want to be. Also, please don't forget that you should not do this alone. So what we really recommend is that you reach out to faculty who you have worked with, find some people who are willing to mentor you through this process. And then, of course, you have us here at ONSA. The advisors are here to help you. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Habza, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about the research projects.
Hi, everyone. So some of the other details that you should be thinking about when you're considering a Fulbright research project is that it's essential to read every single word of the program summary on the Fulbright U.S. Students site, because program design varies from country to country. So if you're looking around in these early stages, doing your comparison shopping and trying to figure out which country you're going to go to, once you decide on that country, you're going to want to print out that country summary and return to it over and over again throughout the application process, because you will read it differently as you advance on your project. And every single one of those countries is incredibly different from each other, which is why Dr. Stoff says their answer to many of these questions is it depends, because so much is dependent on what's being offered by a country, what they are seeking, and what else they want from these kinds of projects. And they will also have different rules and regulations about what students can do in those countries and what kind of research they prioritize. Some of them will encourage students to incorporate coursework into their projects, so you can take courses at an institution while also conducting your research project. Part of the reason for this is so that you have a contact in country, that you are participating in the culture of the country and learning at their institution. Other times they will allow you to just propose an independent research project that may not have to be based at an institution, but it can be based with an NGO, or it can be based with some other kind of organization. Again, that will vary from country to country, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss the affiliate aspect of the application. And some research topics will be preferred, as I said before, and others will be discouraged. So read through those carefully, figure out where you fit in, and talk to an advisor about it too. Sometimes that language can be a little hard to parse, and figuring out where your research project fits into what they're looking for. Some countries are very, very detailed. I know Colombia, for example, has like a laundry list of everything that they're looking for in research projects, and other countries are just like, we welcome research. So you kind of do have to figure out where you fit in and be patient with the process. And every country will also have specific expectations for language proficiency and also the affiliation letters. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in some future slides. Next slide, please. So one thing that I think we've really been emphasizing during this presentation is fit. And making sure that everything fits together. And so a project must be well thought out. One question we're going to ask you several hundred times during the application process is, why are you applying to this country? Why this specific country? And one specific example that I really like to refer to when I'm talking about this with students is when I was at Purdue University, I worked with a doctoral student who was applying to Fulbright in New Zealand. She was in kinesiology, and she was studying the impact of concussions on football players. She had found a group of researchers in New Zealand who were studying the impact of concussions on rugby players. In her research, she also discovered that these two groups of people were not talking to each other. And so they were getting different findings, different results, different methodologies. And so she made a proposal that she would go to New Zealand, begin to build these connections between these two labs, and that we would be able to learn more about concussions in the US from what New Zealand was doing, and that they would also be able to learn more about concussions in sports in New Zealand from what the US was doing. And these sports are very important to these cultures. So there's also that moment of cultural exchange. And so that was, to me, a very good illustration of finding fit for a country. How can this specific country benefit from this project? And also, how can the relationship between the two countries benefit from the nature of this project? So as you're thinking about which country you want to go to, it can't be, I like croissants, I want to go to France, as Dr. Stoff pointed out earlier. It's really looking for that narrow focus of how this will be beneficial to both countries and cultures. Some fields have this a little easier than others. For example, anthropology. If you're studying one culture that only exists in one country, well, that's a pretty easy justification. However, for some other projects, it can be undertaken in multiple countries. And so that's when you really have to figure out how everything comes together and why it's necessary for you to leave the US. So what can you do there that you can't do just staying at your home institution in the US or going to another institution in the US? And you also want to really focus on how the project will allow you to engage with the host country community. Again, the focus here is mutual beneficence, cultural exchange. And so you don't want to be proposing a project that's just going to have you locked away in a lab in which you aren't engaging with others in the host country community. Next slide, please. Right, and as I was just saying, the goal of the Fulbright program is to establish mutual understanding through cultural exchange. And one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes students start with the host country and figure out their project. Others figure out the project and then figure out how it fits into a host country. So there's no right way to take that first step. It's figuring out what's the best first step for you. Right, now I'm ready for that next slide with the key selection factors. Thank you. All right, so these are some of the key selection factors that we're about to discuss. So we'll talk about the validity and feasibility of the proposed project, your academic and professional qualifications. What are these readers going to be looking for to make sure that you're able to complete the proposed project? Language proficiency is very important, and there are two different ways to think about that. So I'll talk a little bit further about that. And then we'll discuss community engagement, how to talk about your previous experience in the host country, and diversity. So these are selection factors that every single reader is going to be looking for as they're reading through these applications. They're going to look a little bit different for every single applicant, and this is how they make their decisions. And so we want to make sure that we are touching on each of these points in every single application, but there won't be a one-size-fits-all way to approach this for every single applicant. So again, fit is going to be very individualized for every applicant. Next slide, please. Right, so first, validity. The first and foremost important factor is this a valid project? And so your readers are going to be readers who are going to be academics outside of your field, generally. These reviewers tend to lean towards the humanities, social sciences, and languages, but you could get someone in any field reading your application, which means it's really important not just to communicate the validity of your project to someone in your field. You can take shortcuts to communicating that validity, but you have to communicate the validity of your project to someone who is in any field so that they can understand and appreciate what your project is all about. And so some of the ways that you can go about communicating the validity of your project is to relate it to your personal and professional goals. Where are you going after this Fulbright, and how will this Fulbright project support that, right? So for that student in kinesiology, she had to communicate what she wanted to do, which was become a researcher on concussions. Well, that is one project that can help advance her towards that goal. So connecting those dots for readers and not just letting it be self-evident that one day you may continue researching this, right? How does this project fit into your larger career goals? Why is it best accomplished in this location? What resources in that location? So it's not just about the country itself. It's looking at the particular groups, institutions you're going to be working with, looking at the cities and communities that they are situated in, and thinking about what resources are available there for you that aren't available at other areas. And so that means you have to do some research on the institutions that you plan to apply to, on the organizations that you plan to work with. And we'll talk about this when we get to the affiliate. It may also mean contacting people to learn more about what's available to applicants in that country who might be completing similar projects. You also have to communicate to this audience that the project is compelling and timely. Why do we need it? Why does it matter? What is at stake? And when we're communicating what is at stake, it's thinking about what is possible once this project is completed that is currently not possible. What can someone do once you complete this research project that they cannot currently do? What can you do that you cannot currently do? And why does this matter both for the US population, and why does it matter for the population for the host country? So what is the social relevance of this project? And again, some fields are going to have an easier time with explaining that. I think sometimes the humanities and social sciences are a little bit more attuned to those kinds of answers. However, in science and sciences in STEM, sorry, I'm puddling there. In STEM, social and behavioral sciences, sometimes that translation isn't always quite there. And so you have to figure out why is this socially relevant, and how is this going to matter to the State Department? That's the first audience that you have to communicate the validity of this project to. And then why does it matter to the host country? And anyone in that host country, if the application gets there, can be reading that application. So you have to imagine that maybe there's an economist in the host country who's reading this. Maybe there's an ambassador who's reading this. And so they also have to be able to appreciate and understand why the project is compelling and timely. And as advisors, we're really helpful with coming up with explanations, helping you figure out the explanation for why this is compelling and timely. So for communicating feasibility of a project, it's not just about communicating whether someone can complete the project. It's about communicating that you can complete the project. And so you want to make sure that the project plan is clearly developed. Walk them through a timeline. What are you doing in stage 1? What are you doing in stage 2? What are you doing in stage 3? Every Fulbright application has different timelines. They generally are a full academic year, 9 to 10 months, but you want to check that host country summary to make sure what the timeline is that you're expected to work within. When are you expected to be in country? When are you expected to leave? And you have to plan your project within that timeline. You also want to make sure it's reasonable. So, as we all may know, academics are very good at poking holes into things, right? Timelines are one thing that they poke holes into when they're reading over a student's project, because we want to make sure that the student can be successful, particularly if they are doing a lot of this on their own and they are taking initiative to complete these projects. So when you're putting your timeline together, really be reasonable with what can you do within that timeline. So for a student who's conducting interviews, how long do they need to conduct those interviews with the number of people that they're recruiting for those interviews? How long do they need to maybe translate those transcriptions? And so looking at each stage of that project, you have to fit it into a timeline that is feasible and appropriate to the project. And that's a really good thing to work with us on and your faculty mentors. Because again, we want students to be successful at their projects, and reviewers cannot ask you questions. So if they have questions about the timeline, if they have questions about any of your plans, they can't ask you them. So we want to make sure everything is clearly explained as possible. And then we also want to ensure that the methodology is appropriate to the host country. So we don't want to potentially be stepping on any toes, talking about taboo topics, or conducting a research topic that might not be appropriate to the country. So I can't help but think of a presentation I went to a few years ago, where the winner of RuPaul's Drag Race, Sasha Velour, talked about her time on a Fulbright in Russia. And she was talking about how challenging it was to do research on queer art in Russia on that grant, because that is a taboo subject there. And so you want to make sure that there's alignment between your project and the host country's values, but also ensuring that the methodology is also appropriate too. So what the type of interview that you'd be doing there, is that appropriate to the cultural values of that country? And that's something to think through and talk about with advisors as you're planning your project. And then finally, you also want to ensure that you have the necessary training. These are your qualifications. Have you done a pilot study? Have you done something that's a proof of concept? Do you have any publications that you've written? Or what's your experience in research labs doing similar methods and methodologies? So what are your qualifications? That helps them understand that you're able to take up this project and see it through to its completion. This is not the time to be doing something completely new and different that you've never done before, because readers may not think that you are qualified to conduct the work that you are proposing. And then additionally, language proficiency is an important qualification. So there's two different ways to think about language proficiency. Let me just look ahead and make sure I'm not jumping ahead of myself here. I am, so I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But language proficiency is one of those important qualifications. In cultural awareness, demonstrating that you understand that how your project is going to be taken under this culture. And so if there is a qualitative aspect where you're engaging with people, talking with people, demonstrating that you are sensitive to what kinds of issues may arise in that project and how you're going to overcome those issues, that's also important too. So if there are obstacles that you may encounter in completing the project, don't ignore talking about them. Instead, address them and talk about how you're going to overcome those particular obstacles so that you are demonstrating cultural awareness. All right, next slide, please. Oh, you're already there. Great, thank you. So for feasibility and affiliation, so another aspect of a feasible project is demonstrating that you have made connections in the country that want to work with you. And so this is called the affiliation. Applicants can have up to 3 affiliate letters. You only need 1 in most applications. This varies from country to country as to what their expectations are. Most researchers end up working with someone at a university. Some countries require that the primary affiliate be someone at a university. Others don't have the same requirements. So you always want to make sure that your primary affiliate meets the country's requirements. And sometimes there's processes involved that the country requires when contacting affiliates. Others do not. So read through that country summary carefully. And so many times students end up working with someone at a university, but other times there's research institutes, NGOs, government ministries. So it's thinking about what are the people in the countries, the institutions in the countries that make the most sense for you to carry out your project. Sometimes students have to triangulate that. So they work with a researcher at a university who's familiar with the research and who can serve as a guide in the country on the research. And then if they want to work with an NGO, they also do that as well, or they work with the ministry, or they work with an institute. So you don't have to just pick one. And if you can get letters of support from multiple people in the country that show that they are enthusiastic about this project, that they really want to see it come to fruition, that they have the resources available to help you, that's really going to improve the quality of your application. And so students have to reach out to these affiliates on their own, and we counsel you through how to go about that process. This is often a little bit later in the application process. You've gone through a couple of drafts of revision of the statement of grant purpose so that you can clearly communicate what you want to do to the affiliate, and so that there aren't need to have drastic conversations later about completely changing the project, right? We want to make sure that we're contacting them at an appropriate time so that you're having the most effective communication about your project with them possible. And strong letters of affiliation will outline in-country resources available to supporting your project. And again, those requirements vary from country to country, and we provide lots of guidance both in person and on our Canvas on how to go about this process. It may seem intimidating, but many students have gone through it, they've succeeded at it, and making those cold calls and communicating with these people overseas, and we will see you through this part of the process as well. Just something to consider as you're putting all the pieces together. All right, next slide, please. Right, academic qualifications, also very, very important, but it's not just the GPA. So oftentimes when we hear about academic qualifications, we just focus on the GPA and go, okay, my GPA is this, but the readers are going to be looking at for a more holistic view of qualifications. So they want to make sure you have adequate formal training, as I indicated before. Have you done this research before in a lab? What kinds of coursework have you taken to prepare you for conducting this research project? Do you have something like a pilot study or proof of concept, conference presentations, publications? Any of those can help demonstrate that you have adequate formal training to complete the project. And if you are a student who maybe had a rockier start at the beginning of your undergraduate career and you have had improvement throughout time, I know many students, we sometimes, myself included, have a rocky start, and then we find our footing, we find our place, we find the thing we're interested in, and we begin to excel. And so if that is you, there is a way to tell those stories and those narratives. You have control over that narrative. And so an upward grade trend counts a lot. So if you're concerned that maybe your GPA may not be high enough for this award, don't count yourself out yet. Have a conversation with an advisor about how to go about presenting that information to your readers and how they may holistically look at the application. One thing to keep in mind is that candidates of varying degree levels of professional experience are not compared. So they shouldn't be comparing doctoral students to, students who are just fresh out of their undergraduate experience, but they will be compared to their peers. Reviewers are asked to think about how does this compare to someone who is in similar standing of similar experience who's also applying for the fellowship. All right, next slide, please. All right, so finally, language proficiency is another one of those qualifications, and there's two ways to think about it. So the host country will have its own stipulations about what the expectation is for a student to speak the language of that country. So in countries in which there's a reasonable expectation in which a student can become advanced or fluent in that language, such as France, Spain, then there are those expectations. In countries such as the Czech Republic, where there isn't quite a reasonable expectation that someone in the US can become fluent in Czech, they might not have those same expectations. So every country is going to have different expectations for what is required for language proficiency. Sometimes they use the language recommended, not required. If it's recommended, we still think that we should follow those guidelines and make sure that we're doing everything that's recommended. But if it's required, then there is no bending that. There's no getting around that. And you also have to think about, in addition to what's required, what is required for the project. Those are two different levels of proficiency sometimes. So sometimes a country can say, you only need to have novice experience with this language. But if a student is going there to conduct qualitative interviews, well, then they need to figure out if they're doing that in that language or if they need a translator there. And if they need a translator, sometimes there's questions about whether that's appropriate for the project. And so you want to, again, talk about the feasibility and your experience with the language. Learning it after applying is not the time to learn it. You want to keep learning it, but if you want to demonstrate that you are serious about committing to learning the language and communicating with people of the host country, which is another reason why you need to know the language, and maybe one of the most important reasons for knowing the language, then you want to go ahead and start getting that practice now if you don't have experience with the language of the host country. And that's something to talk about in your application. How are you already preemptively trying to seriously engage with the host country? Another thing that I want to point out is sometimes students are invited to interviews when they are made semifinalists. So if you are selected as a semifinalist, the host country will invite the applicant to an interview. And sometimes, particularly in Mexico, though, that interview may be conducted in a foreign language. So if you are submitting an application, keep practicing the language after you submit in case you have to prepare for using the foreign language in an interview later. We want to make sure that you're prepared for that experience. Having conversational ability is a big plus for the languages, and these are all assessed with a foreign language evaluation. So you just don't say, I'm really good at French. You actually have to take an evaluation that is overseen by a professor of that language at ASU. They write something up similar to a recommendation letter, but it's not formal, but you don't get to see it. And then they submit it, and that goes along with your application as well, communicating to the readers what your level of proficiency is with the language. And we have resources on our Canvas to connect you to those resources on campus when you are ready for that stage. I think that's it for me today. So I'm ready to hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Bhattacharya.
Hello there. So as you know, the Fulbright is intended to increase understanding between countries, and part of that is having you actually interact with people, get to know the cultures, and for people to also interact with you and get to know a little bit more about what it means for Americans to be Americans and what we do here, how we live here. So engagement with the host community in most cases is really essential to the Fulbright experience. It's not just your classes, it's not just your research, but really being out in the community and connecting with people. So when we have the national screening committees, when we have our interviews on campus, reviewers are looking at what kinds of extracurricular activities people have and what sort of sense they have of the community they're going into and how they might want to connect to that community, thinking about what issues are in common, what kinds of concerns are in common. So trying to spell out a community engagement activity is really important, sort of thinking about concrete things that you can do, whether it is sort of participating in a particular dance group or sort of maybe leading a sports team, or there's so many other kinds of things that are outside, which are going to be mostly defined by your own particular strengths and interests and how you can best interact with people and introduce them also to American culture. So when you are talking about these things, they're not just something on the side, but something that you're going to actually have to talk about within abstracts within the application itself. It's also the case that the recommenders are people that should know sort of a bit more about you and be able to speak to how you would interact in the community, whether you actually have interests or whether you're just making them up. That wouldn't be the case. You wouldn't make up interests, but in any case, they want to know that you're an interesting person and that you're going to have sort of ideas for how to interact with the community. The CCE, that our interview committees on campus, are also writing up about you to evaluate you before we endorse you, are also going to look at sort of what forms of community engagement you're describing and talking about. So it's not something that is just an after thing to think about. It's something that is really essential to the application. Thanks. Next slide, please. So in terms of how much experience you have and whether it's good to have experience and whether experience within that country is important, there are so many different ways of looking at experience, but generally speaking, if you're trying to get funding from the US State Department to go abroad to a particular country, they're going to prefer people who have not had a lot of experience already in that country. They're trying to increase the diversity of people who are familiar with that region. So it doesn't make sense, right, to send the same people over and over and over again. That said, if you have experience being abroad and you have actually sort of been able to demonstrate that you're somebody who's flexible and adaptable and have experience carrying out research projects in different places and adjusting to different circumstances, if you have been in an area where you have had to demonstrate expertise in a language that is the same or closely related to that is in the country that you're applying to, all these kinds of things are huge strengths in your application. So on one hand, if you are applying to the actual country that you've already been in, that might be something that is not preferred. On the other hand, having sort of related experiences in other areas and other contexts is something that people look at very favorably, because if you've done something once, obviously, successfully, you're going to be prepared, that much more prepared and ready to actually do it again and do something different, even better. Thank you. So yes, next slide, thanks. As we were just saying, they're trying to increase the number of people who are going from different areas, from different kinds of experiences. We don't want people to think about Americans in very narrow ways based on what they've seen in television or really old sort of school books about Dick and Jane and Spot the dog. So in any case, we want to have a huge range of people who are representing the US and all the different experiences and backgrounds of people who make up the richness of our country. So US geographic distribution is something that they pay attention to. And for the most part, that actually is good for us, because if you're thinking about all the people who are applying from places like California or say the East Coast, or especially the Northeast, like there are tons and tons of people who were applying from Massachusetts and New York State, New Jersey. You're not those people. You're not people who are applying from LA or San Francisco. So to be in the Southwest, you have a distinctive profile. You have experience in an area of the country that is not necessarily always well represented. So that is a good thing for you to be from the Southwest. It's also the case that to have a sort of range of different kinds of institutions, it's also, again, it's a good thing to be from Arizona State University. If we had only Ivy League institutions that were sending people forward, we would have a really narrow bunch of people who are representing the US, and that's not really going to further understanding between our countries. So they are paying attention to geographic distribution. They're paying attention to making sure that people are coming from schools all over the different sort of areas of the country, also different types of schools, whether you're from a four-year liberal arts college, or whether you're from a major research university, or whether you're from a regional school. It is all sort of important to have different kinds of schools that are represented. Also, they're looking at ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic diversity. So once again, if you're not sort of somebody who has had what might be in the past considered to be a typical profile, maybe you grew up in a family that was not sort of middle class or upper middle class, or maybe you grew up in an area of the country where you did not necessarily have a lot of people who looked like you have a particular experience to bring to the country that you are going to. So if you're thinking about your cultural background, your history, your relationship to your family, what sort of connections you might even have to the areas that you are interested in going to do research, that sometimes comes up for some people. There are all sorts of things that are very interesting about people and are really important to talk about. So it involves you're being comfortable talking about yourself and your history and the challenges you faced on a personal level. But on the other hand, sort of people getting to learn who you are and what you care about and how you're going to bring a distinctive sort of experience to people who've never met an American like you, and you're going to enrich their idea of what an American is. It's also the case that they don't want to have people who are just all sort of neuroscience majors or people who are doing research in environmental conservation. As important as these things are, we have brains, we have environments, those are important. We also need people looking at things are in the social sciences, maybe looking at political science topics, or people in the humanities who are interested in linguistic sort of areas, or the history of particularly literatures or languages or arts or music. So again, they're trying to get a large range of people from different kinds of experiences, different backgrounds, different expertise. And they do that with the aim of sort of representing the richness of the people who make up our country. Thank you. Next slide, please. So when you start your application, you're going to be starting to work on your statement of grant purpose, which, as Dr. Stoff and Dr. Hobsa indicated, is a 2-page long thing that has to pack in pretty much everything that people need to know about how you're going to carry out your project, why they should give you money to carry out that project, why it's interesting, why the project's important. So these really key questions, we're reviewing some of the things that we talked about before, but just to hammer in, these are really, really important questions to think about, and maybe actually questions that you would want to start your own draft with as you're sort of sketching out how to think about your project. So you want to know, what do you propose to do? What's your goal as a researcher? Why? Why do you want to undertake this project? What's motivating you? What's innovative, right, about this research? Why is it something we should pay attention to? Why will people find it compelling? How does it bring something new to what we know already? What's it going to contribute in terms of expanding our knowledge? So that obviously has to do with what's important or significant about the project. Again, it's not necessarily the case that you have to save the entire world with your project, but you have to make a case for why people should care. It's also the case that, as Dr. Hobsa and Dr. Stoff already said, that you need to think about why you're particularly choosing this country that you're applying to. What's distinctive about that country? What makes it particularly conducive to doing the kind of research that you have? What resources are available there in terms of people, in terms of geographic environments, in terms of climate, whatever it might be? We don't want you to just pick a random place. We want you to have a really particular reason for making a case for why you should be the person to be there, as opposed to all the other people who are applying for that country. So all these issues are hard to think about, and they require some research. But one way to think about it is, if you didn't get the Fulbright and if you were stuck here, what would your options be? And what would sort of be things that you would not be able to do? What do you have to be abroad to actually carry out? What can you not do in Zoom interviews? These are the kinds of things that people are going to be looking for in your application. Next slide, please. Feasibility, as we talked about this before, we want to know that you are actually capable of carrying out what you have proposed to carry out. So demonstrating that you're familiar with research methods and methodologies in your discipline is important. You're speaking to people who don't know your discipline, but you're also going to potentially be speaking to people who do know your discipline and are going to want to know that you know what you're doing. You want to also talk about your affiliate, talk about the people whom you're going to be working with, why it makes sense to work with that particular group, whether you've had contact with them. We hope you have sort of thought about what kinds of resources are there. One thing that is really important when you're thinking about trying to define the project is the timeline. And this part is hard because you have to think about all the different stages and components of your project. If your project is something that people could conceivably do in 2 months, that's great, but it doesn't make sense then for Fulbright to give you funding for 9 months. This is not a Fulbright project. So people are going to be looking at your project. Is it the appropriate scale? Are you actually sort of thinking about all the different steps and parts of your project that need to be completed in the area and making a good case for why you need to be in this country for this amount of time. It's really, really, really important that you think about that. And again, sort of thinking about community engagement, sort of think about like what's possible there. If you're going to be going to sort of South America and the Amazon, you probably don't want to talk about sort of bleeding ice skating meetings and lessons. So I mean, you have to think about what is actually possible in the area that you are looking at, and whether it's important to carry out. So we're coming to the end of the hour now, and I wanted to make sure that we leave some time for questions. So I'm actually going to wrap up what I am talking about here. We have one more slide that Dr. Stoff has given us here, which we've also already touched on, but these questions as to how you're qualified, but also why it makes sense for you to be the person to do this at this particular time, and how you're going to help our countries in the future. These are all things that you should be thinking about all along. All right, so this is probably the time that we can talk about next steps. So we have another wonderful Fulbright Friday coming up for you next week, which we'll be talking more about putting together your application, essays. So in the meantime, make an appointment with us. Just go to onsa.asu.edu, select what kind of award you are interested in applying for, and you will be asked to select one of us based on your available times, and we will be happy to meet with you. So there is no time that's too early to do that. Like sign up for a meeting tomorrow. Actually, no, not tomorrow. You can sign up for a meeting tomorrow, but we're not going to meet you until Monday. So just do that as soon as possible. We'd love to meet with you. And at any point during the summer, we're also happy to meet with you. Thanks. And this is where you can find us. So we're all here. We're available via sort of making appointments. We have all of our webinars recorded on YouTube. We're also on Slack. We can sort of get to quick questions there. Our Fulbright site, which is online, has lots and lots and lots of resources and different questions that people have brought up in the year. So you can spend some time there. We also have our Canvas site that has a lot of resources there too. And in the meantime, also you want to check out sort of the information that is being provided by the Fulbright sort of foundation themselves. So look for your country, the particular types of awards that are being offered. Those things change all the time. So you spend time there as well. Thanks. You guys have any questions at this particular point?
So let's just stop the share for a second. And I did see Simone had a question. So go ahead, Simone.
Hi. Oh, I don't know what happened. Could you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so I just had a quick question about the intake appointment. I know that those questions, for the key questions that you had at the end of the presentation, were really helpful. I was just wondering, is there something that we should have prepared before our first intake appointment? Like, should we have those questions kind of like fill them out, or is it just really like a first time meeting type of appointment?
Yeah, those intake appointments are designed just to get you acquainted with us, to start thinking about. Sometimes students come in and they don't even know which program they want to apply for yet. They don't know what country they want. We're just there to kind of familiarize you with everything, walk you through, and then we give you some homework for the next appointment, and that is to start choosing your country, choosing your program, thinking about those questions. And then we have a follow-up to that, which we get you started like drafting. So you don't, you can come in with all the ideas or zero ideas. It's totally flexible.
Okay,
you're not
perfect.
getting on anything. I was just going to say, you should probably know, and some people are surprised sometimes, you can only apply to one country. So you can only really start the application process once you have figured out what country you're going to apply for. And then you can you can sort of start everything and sort of start drafting things, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense to start your drafting and going into things until you have figured out which country you're looking at.
Okay, perfect. Great. That's perfect. I'll schedule an appointment soon then.
And then in our next webinar, we will walk through those questions that Dr. Bhattacharya kind of gave us an overview of, it more specificity, and then give you some examples and give you some advice from our expert on writing processes, Dr. Habza, on how to start that writing, which for many students is difficult, right? That's always kind of the big hurdle you have to get over, and give you some ideas about productivity and ways to maximize your time in writing. And so don't worry if you can't answer all those questions yet. Like these are things that are going to will flesh out over time, and we'll get to everything. So by the time you have a completed application, we'll have addressed all these things, but certainly you don't need to have them answered right now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you guys.
Great. Do you have any more questions? We love questions.
Well, I do realize we did give you a lot of information. It's probably a lot to process. So take the weekend, think about it. Do attend our next webinar, same time, next Friday, same bat channel. We will record it as well and have that on our YouTube video. If you have not yet watched our Getting Started video, that's a really good place to get kind of all those basic questions answered. And then, yes, make intake appointments with us so that we can help you. All right, well, great. Thank you all so much again for joining us. And I wish you all a great weekend.